Advent is our time of awaiting, when we are called upon to think of the last things, of death and of judgment, of heaven and of hell. And today you were given both barrels straight to the face with our readings from Joel and from Revelation. You'll probably be more familiar with the quotation from Joel quoted in the other order. There was nothing wrong in the reading this morning. You were correct when you heard Joel commending those who were listening to him to beat their ploughshares into swords and their pruning hooks into spears. It's much more familiar to us quoted the other way around, swords into ploughshares and spears into pruning hooks. And of course we were hearing that reading just weeks ago at our remembrance service. And my goodness, do we not pray that we would be in that generation that were beating swords to ploughshares and spears to pruning hooks? But Joel reminds us that as well as times of peace, there are times of tribulation. Today, we're given that opposing vision, both in the reading from Joel and in the reading from Revelation, of that time of tribulation. And it's not just a time of war, certainly that's part of it, but what one must remember is that at the time, 90% of all people are farmers. You need to be in order to find something to eat, and so beating your ploughshare into a sword doesn't only get you ready for war, but it makes you also completely ill-prepared to eat anything, whether you're victorious or the loser. So not only is it a time for warfare, but it's also a time of desperation and of famine upcoming. This is reflected in the apocalyptic imagery that John gives us in the reading we heard from Revelation. The most evocative image must be of that reaping of the grapes by the angel. Stick your sickle in, it says. And then their subsequent treading in the winepress of God's wrath. For most of us, I imagine, this process is fairly foreign, but it would have been very familiar at the time to those who were reading. Israel and Judah were not only making wine for themselves, but they were also great exporters of wine at this time to much of the ancient world. The process is the harvesting of the grapes when they're at their absolute moment of ripeness before they burst, fall to the ground, and are ruined or eaten up by the animals. And then you place them in a sort of large carved-out vat in the floor, and you jump on top of them. It was a few years after this that they started using kind of sluices and big screwy things to crush stuff down with stones. But at this time, by far and away, the most usual process would have been the crushing under the feet. It's tactile. You get to do the squashing of the grapes yourself, and the closest I suppose I've ever got to it is one of those horrible moments where, on reaction, you kick out your foot because you see a bug skittering across the floor in front of you, and it squashes underneath, and you suddenly feel this wave of nausea in the crunching and the squishing. I imagine that's what it's like to be trampling on these grapes and to feel each one pop when the critical weight on top of it becomes too much. And there's a great benefit to doing this as well, rather than crushing with rocks or with stones. It's not as quick, trampling on the grapes, but the soles of one's feet are significantly softer, gentler than a large rock. And that means that you squeeze out the good-tasting juice from the grape without ever crushing the bitter seeds. You get the sweetness without the bitterness. It's a process then of refinement, not just of destruction. The idea isn't to just completely obliterate the grapes. The idea is to process and refine them into something even more wonderful. And that's the way for us to think of the winepress of God's wrath. Some of you might struggle with the imagery. Maybe some of you don't find it a problem at all. When I was growing up, I lived in a little flat in Tooting, not far from here, and the woman who lived above me when I was born was called Mrs. Gage, and her favourite thing to say was how much she was looking forward to, and she'd quote Psalm 23 here, how much she was looking forward to that moment when God would spread a table for her in the presence of her enemies. She was a woman full of vengeance. She couldn't wait for that moment where they'd all be looking on longingly at the feast that she'd have. Her cup would be full and overflowing, and she'd be able to say, I told you so. Look at my reward here while you're all off there in the outer darkness. Evidently, I haven't found myself enemies yet of significant proportion to feel that same thing that she did. Maybe some of you have no problem with the winepress of God's wrath. Maybe you're very much looking forward to your enemies being crushed underfoot. But for some of us, this is quite terrible language. And it's reflected elsewhere in the scriptural canon, particularly in the refinement of gold and silver. High heat applied to the metal to purify. It's a process that produces the best product in the end, but it's a pretty rough process while you're going through it. We get the same image about fuller's soap and the rubbing of cloth to remove stain. It's a brutal, energetic process, but one that produces the best in the end. Of course, the less there is to be rid of, then the easier the process of purifying. And this is why, as believers, John's words shouldn't be too much of a worry to us. They're about victory and vindication as much as they're about judgment. And of course, judgment you can approach from both sides. There were plenty of times that I handed in a piece of homework very much not looking forward to receiving it back, because I knew that the teacher was going to judge it and there would be a big bright red F on it. But there were times also when I very much looked forward to judgment, because I knew I had handed in something truly splendid and I couldn't wait to have it handed back to me with the A and the headmaster's distinction stamped on it. Judgment can be a terrifying thing when we know we are poor, and it can be a wonderful thing when we look forward to having the confirmation that we have been judged and found good. So get your sickle in might be good news for us who believe. It might be about God rendering judgment on the injustice of this world. It might be about God creating his righteous kingdom. It's only a bother, of course, to us if we're part of that perpetuation of injustice. And here, I think, is the fundamental difference for us hearing these words and for those to whom they were first spoken, those first century, second century Christians hearing John's rendering of Revelation. It's written for them, an oppressed people. They're under Roman occupation. They're given special attention because of their Christian beliefs. They are hated and oppressed by pretty much everybody. They're also a people committed to peace. There were no first and second century Christian soldiers. That's why there were so many first and second century Christian martyrs. They were unwilling to commit violence, but they were willing to die for their faith. Their only hope was placed in the justice and the rescue of their God. And for their ears, this was the promise that one day evil would be confronted by God and overcome, that it would be purged, and that God's righteousness and good order will flourish. These are words for a promised future that they were all too ready to arrive. And as John goes on to describe, this river of blood that pours out from the winepress will eventually become the river of living water that feeds every nation and every people and symbolizes our healing and our salvation. In the end, how we feel about the winepress of God's wrath rather depends on how we view ourselves. Are we those handing in our homework in the hope of receiving the A in the headmaster's distinction, or are we those who fear that next week when it gets handed back, there'll be an F written on it? Are we those who take vengeance into our own hands, or are we those who throw ourselves upon God's mercy and await his coming judgment on the evil of the world? Brothers and sisters, this Advent, make use of the time that you're given to inspect yourself and to ask those questions, and if necessary, to amend your lives. Amen.